I'll just start with some introductions and some caveats here. So this is a dream team that we have here. I'm glad that Martin teed us up. Gary and I will be the nerds and go deep on the science because Claire is here to save our butts and use plain English language to explain everything we talk about first. I'm Katie Kopil from the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research. The slides that Gary and I are going to be presenting are not branded because we're speaking on behalf of a multi-stakeholder effort that includes nonprofit partners, industry, academic experts across a range of expertise. And we're excited to explain to you what's happening in the field, what we're excited about, and what you can expect, what things are and what things aren't. I am also usually presenting to faces I can see. If Helen comes back up, I'll let her use the rating system that my children use, which is like thumbs up, things are good, thumbs medium, I don't know what's happening, and thumbs down, like you got to start again. Gary and Claire, feel free to use that same rating system in terms of are there questions? Are we at the right level? This works for all types of formats. It's universal. And then I think maybe before I jump in, Gary, I'll invite you to talk, and I wanted to start with one example that I think sets the stage on top of what Martin said of why we really need this. Gary, anything you want to add to kick us off?
No, I think you presented it well, and I'm sort of limited my throat.
So I'll make you do all the talking. Is that what you like, boss? You got
I'll
it.
save my voice a little bit to when I can
Okay.
hop in with something that's useful.
Okay.
If I have anything.
No, this is you're the expert here. So I'd like to jump off the question, the last question that Martin received said, someone was diagnosed a long time ago, they're progressing at a different rate than somebody who was diagnosed more recently that has a rapid rate of progression. And I'd like to set the foundation on this idea that when you're diagnosed is not concrete. It's very subjective. It's based on what bothers you. It's based on your access to healthcare. It's not like you go to sleep one day and you're totally fine, and the next day you wake up and you have Parkinson's. There's a journey towards getting a diagnosis that is very different based on people's experiences and where they are in life. And so I think this is one of the challenges that the staging system is trying to help address in some ways, that the duration of disease or time since diagnosis is, while an absolute number, is also highly subjective and not very consistent. And one of the reasons that I think this is so important to move away from clinical diagnosis is that I'm sure you can all relate to either personally or know someone that had a challenge of getting an accurate diagnosis. And at the Fox Foundation, we sponsor this very large, robust natural history study called the Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative. There are over 2,000 individuals with or at risk for Parkinson's that are participating in the study. There's international sites that participate. And every year in the spring, we have this annual investigators meeting. About 300 of the world's experts in Parkinson's come together and talk about the PPMI study and what we're learning. And I'd say over the last 5 years, there's consistently a session where there are video case studies of participants who have been enrolled in the PPMI study as at risk for Parkinson's. And then they poll the audience, watching a video of someone walking down the hall or doing these types of assessments. Would you give this person a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease? And you would hope in a room of 300 of the world's experts that there is consensus, and there's absolutely no consensus. And this is why we need better tools to be able to accurately diagnose people and to make sure that, to Martin's point, that we're able to enroll the right people in the right trials and accelerate therapeutic development. So with that background, I'd like to start with the concept of if you're looking at people walking down the hall, you're going to be looking at something different than if you're looking at a biomarker. And let's see, I don't think this is the right format. Perhaps I'll go to presentation mode. Does this work? Gary, Claire, good, okay. And one of the paradigm shifts that the staging system is based on is that if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And I think this is an opportunity to really overcome some of the hurdles that Martin had articulated, I'm sure you've heard about in other sessions about drug development today. And can we use a shift towards looking at biological definitions of disease to change a very challenging paradigm that exists today for drug development. So I like to keep this in mind. If you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. With that, development of transformative treatments for Parkinson's disease, but all diseases, really requires a precision approach. I'd like to draw a parallel. Martin presented a nice, very serene iceberg to suggest Parkinson's disease is complex. On the left-hand side here, we'll call this the Venn diagram from hell. A little bit less serene, but the same concept that diseases associated with Lewy bodies, with aggregated alpha-synuclein, have a constellation of symptoms, neuropsychiatric symptoms, cognitive, sleep disturbances, issues with sensory perception, motor issues, autonomic issues. And if you're looking at clinical symptoms, indeed, there are many different types of clinical terminologies that are used today, and people get diagnosed clinically, or their diagnosis might change based on these clinical symptoms. Parkinson's disease, dementia with Lewy bodies, Lewy body disease, Lewy body dementia. Don't ask me to explain why these are different. These seem very similar to me. Dementia with Lewy bodies, PD dementia, prodromal Parkinson's disease, prodromal dementia with Lewy bodies. And these all fit with a constellation of different types of symptoms, the heterogeneity that you see in Parkinson's disease, and why so many patient advocacy organizations say if you've met one person with Parkinson's, you've met one person with Parkinson's, and you don't have a holistic sense of the disease continuum. So that's the current state. And I think the future state, the opportunity to look at things differently, is by thinking about the biology. And could you, rather than starting with the clinical symptoms that somebody has and trying to categorize them that way, could you set that aside and look at the underlying biomarkers associated with their disease and try to start to interrogate diseases based on the biology that are linked, that may lead to different types of clinical syndromes? And I think that's an opportunity that's being pursued with this idea of biological classification of disease in a biological staging system. I was unaware also that previous talks were going to be on SAA. Must not have looked at the agenda Helen circulated, or that Martin was going to do such a nice job of articulating what synuclein seeding assay is, what dopamine imaging looks like. Well, just re-emphasize here that because of breakthroughs in biomarker tools, we no longer have to wait until autopsy to understand the types of biological changes that somebody has in their brain associated with Parkinson's disease. These biomarker tools that now exist allow measurement of biology in individuals during life. And this is really the opportunity that we have to build on in terms of a staging system. You're going to hear two letters throughout the rest of this presentation. The first one is S, and S it is representative of pathological alpha-synuclein in neurons. That's what is a classical hallmark of Parkinson's disease. We think this should, the group that has developed this staging system believes that this is one of the key biological anchors for redefining disease, or at least subtype of disease. And this idea of a biological staging framework is not some commandment from down on high written on stone tablets, that this is meant to be a flexible framework. And so while we believe, the team believes that pathological alpha-synuclein is a critical biologic anchor for staging, today it is best measured by the synuclein seed amplification assay, but we believe that there are opportunities to expand on this in the future to different matrices, to different types of assays, ways to reliably measure the alpha-synuclein, pathologic alpha-synuclein in the brain through other biomarker tests. So S is one of the biologic anchors. Synuclein is one of the biologic anchors of this staging system. The other is D for dysfunction, degeneration of dopamine neurons. I think this is such a powerful tool where you see, okay, if you have not had a chance to take a neuroanatomy class, you'll be very delighted if you could audit a course. There are very few structures in the brain where people can, or neuropathologists, or even measly graduate students like me could look at the brain and say, hey, I see something there in that dark comma shape on the left-hand side. Those pigmented cells are the dopaminergic cells that help control motor systems within the brain, and in Parkinson's disease, that's what goes missing. We believe that this very classic feature of degeneration of these types of neurons is another biologic anchor that should be used in the staging of Parkinson's and related disorders. And the way to measure that today is by DAT scan, and you can see an image similar to what Martin had presented moments ago, where you can look at the changes in the neuronal tissue and how that reflects in an imaging scan. So this ability to measure biomarkers of underlying neuropathology in living people is what gives us an opportunity to think about the biology of the disease versus just the clinical symptoms. Conceptually, these biomarker tools are also helping researchers and clinicians understand the sequence, what happens in Parkinson's and related disorders associated. I should have clarified, neuronal synuclein disease could be an emerging biologic term that would be used in a research setting to help classify people that have a shared biomarker signature. We think that if you look at biomarkers certainly in the PPMI study, but other studies as well, there's evidence to suggest that neuronal alpha-synuclein pathology, this red line, this pathology occurs, or synuclein becomes abnormal before dopamine degeneration, certainly before clinical signs and symptoms of Parkinson's and related disorders, and also before people become impaired by those symptoms. So you see these curves with the y-axis is clinical or biological abnormality, the x-axis is time. And if you put these curves together, synuclein becomes abnormal, perhaps early in the biological forms of disease, and that it could be followed by measurable dopaminergic dysfunction or degeneration, which is this solid blue line in the middle of the purple shading. This is an open question. There's more data that are needed, but this is a way to think about how the order of the biology that leads to the disease. And then clinical signs and symptoms also start somewhere in this period of following abnormal biology, but that there are signs and symptoms that precede any functional impairment. This idea that constipation is a very common prodromal symptom of Parkinson's disease, loss of smell, REM behavior disorder, all these features that don't lead somebody to get diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, but in hindsight seem to be indicative of individuals' risk for developing clinical symptoms. And these stages at the bottom, we'll talk about in a slightly different slide, but the stage 1A to 2B reflect this period of time where people may have signs and clinical symptoms that are driven by biologic disease, but not enough that would take somebody, or in most cases, not enough that would send somebody to a neurologist to get a diagnosis. And then in stages 3 through 6, there are some placeholder numbers or placeholder terms, slight, mild, moderate, which is very unsatisfactory. I talk about this with Gary a lot. We hope that we will get some more objective measures here. But this is reflective. The green line is meant to show increasing functional impairment. And I think the paradigm shift here for clinical trials is to think about the level of somebody's impairment to decide how to enroll people in studies, rather than the disease duration that they've had, because we believe the disease diagnosis and the duration since diagnosis is multifactorial and somewhat artificial. And so the opportunity then is to think about somebody enrolling trials, designing trials in people that have the same level of functional impairment, rather than in individuals who have the same amount of disease duration. And we believe that there would be clinical progression across stages 3 through 6, even if the biology that we can measure today ends up being somewhat static. So this is a graph that a lot of clinicians like. There's a very similar model in the Alzheimer's staging system that has been helpful in helping guide research to fill out uncertainties, but also to guide therapeutic development. And I'm sure many of you are aware of recent FDA approvals of treatments in Alzheimer's disease that use this biologic staging system to both increase success of trials by enrolling the right individuals in trials based on the right mechanism of the presumed treatment, but then also to enroll people with the right level, the more homogeneous amount of clinical symptoms and functional impairment. So while doctors and researchers love this kind of thing, it's very hard to interpret for some people. This is another way to look at the same concept. And I think here in this version of the staging system, you can also look to the left of this very thick black vertical line and be aware that genetic risks are acknowledged within the staging system. It will not surprise anyone that's followed Parkinson's research to know that genes like Parkin, LRRK2, GBA are very interesting targets for therapeutic development, that they put individuals at either low or high risk for developing Parkinson's disease, and are very critical to understanding both disease biology and for therapeutic development. Those individuals are not necessarily staged, but there is an acknowledgement in the staging system that genetics plays a role in the biologic manifestation of disease, even if scientists are still trying to understand what that role is. In stage 0, and the idea is that people, even if you're not getting assessed in clinic and you're, or in a clinical trial, I should say, that people are not captured as moving from stage 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to, so on and so forth, that there is a progression that individuals would follow. The rate is still to be determined. The exception is stage 0, which is a very, very rare group of individuals who have mutations in the gene for alpha-synuclein SNCA, and that very similar to Huntington's disease is fully penetrant, meaning if individuals carry this mutation, they're very almost entirely likely to develop Parkinson's disease or related disorder during their lifetime. Stage 1A and 1B at the moment are not people that are well known, walking around and saying, I have a biomarker of Parkinson's, or I have a biomarker of neuronal synuclein disease. But this is a future opportunity to think about family risk and think about how in a future state there might be opportunities to intervene before the onset of any symptoms. So the stage 1 is meant to reflect a biomarker signature of disease, but no change in any symptoms, or certainly no change in no clinical symptoms associated with Parkinson's related disorders. Stage 2, and the A and B, Claire will explain a little bit more, but it's just about the biomarker status. Stage 2 is where clinical signs and symptoms, whether motor or non-motor, become apparent but aren't limiting for individuals. Say, from various studies, and I don't think we've included this slide, but we're aware most individuals who have received a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease are stage 3 or stage 4 in this system, but there certainly are individuals who would fall into the stage 2. And it's usually individuals who present with a tremor predominant disease, where you'd realize this isn't normal, it's not normal aging, I'm going to go see a neurologist, and they may be diagnosed earlier than somebody who is not tremor predominant. They're not necessarily functionally impaired by the tremor, but they notice it and get diagnosed earlier. Again, most people in this clinical functional impairments purple stage, most people we think would be diagnosed around stage 3, but we also see in PPMI and a couple clinical trial data sets that there are people that are diagnosed at stage 4, considered newly diagnosed at stage 4, stage 5, and it's about what bothers somebody, what brings them to the doctor, and how long it takes to get a diagnosis. And so we think that there could be progression, relevant, important progression, and an opportunity to rethink how clinical trials are designed. Martin mentioned this, and I suspect others have. A lot of trials that are looking at treatments that would slow or stop disease progression are targeting newly diagnosed individuals. Our general counsel at the Fox Foundation is a person with Parkinson's, and talking with him, a lot of times he said, well, that's great, but like, what about me? I was diagnosed 10 years ago, and I would like to participate in these types of trials. And I think this framework gives an ability to think about how do you slow progression from stage 3 to stage 4, from stage 4 to stage 5, because that is still meaningful. And I think it opens up more possibilities for research that are really important, and better tools for drug developers to know that they're testing the right treatments in the right people at the right time. So we just have a couple slides left to talk about in more human terms and less sciencey terms. What does this mean? So what? Who cares? Gary, do you want me to run through this, or do you want to jump in? It looks like you're on mute, Gary. Gary, you're still on mute. We need to unmute you.
I'm a good example of what you were just going through, because I went about 4 years before I was diagnosed. I had some of the early symptoms: loss of smell, RBD, dystonia. But it wasn't until I developed a tremor that I finally went to the neurologist and got diagnosed. And then I began going and signing up for a number of clinical trials that were early stage trials. And I think we have enough problems trying to design trials in Parkinson's, but I think this previous staging was so difficult because it was all based upon years since diagnosis. And early stage in one of the trials I went to was anybody diagnosed within the last 5 years. So if I went in my 5th year since diagnosis, I was really 9 years since my symptoms actually did start. And, you know, we get this whole mishmash of participants participating in the studies, and it makes me wonder if some of the reasons why trials fail, but yet we show responders in some cases where there's good response, has to do with the so far different in the stages in reality along the spectrum. And of course, we know that, you know, progression is a clinical continuum, but using the biological specifics, and as we move along now with this new staging, we will get new biomarkers, and hopefully we'll be able to develop that into new endpoints that are more biologically oriented rather than clinical. And we can sort of break that continuum down based upon the actual biologics that the person has at any given time. And it may be that somebody's at 5 years since diagnosis. Some had 2 years diagnosis, but they're both in stage 2 or stage 3 at some point, because it's the biologics that really determine where we are on the continuum and not the years since we were diagnosed.
Thank you for humanizing and putting it into simple terms, the green and the blue bars here. So the current state, many trials use no biomarkers to screen individuals with Parkinson's for study eligibility. Some use DAT scan to determine eligibility. And I think the future state, and this is not happening tomorrow, but what we expect to happen with the staging system is that trials in the future will have a better understanding of how to use biomarker tests to determine their eligibility criteria, which means that they only enroll volunteers who could benefit from a specific drug. And I think this is so important, Gary. I think you've talked about this. I know Sonia Mather has as well. It's a gift for people to participate in research, and you're taking a risk, your time, perhaps some safety, and to be enrolled in a study that you know won't help you is really a disservice. And I think the opportunity to use biomarkers to recruit the volunteers who have a chance of benefiting from a treatment is a really important advance. The other point, Gary, that you hit on, the eligibility criteria right now are really often based on years since diagnosis. And there's some exceptions to that for symptomatic treatments, but the opportunity to shift now towards more objective, at least if still patient-reported outcomes, which have some level of subjectivity, something that's better reflecting the disease severity rather than the time since a diagnosis. I think the other pieces here that I'm excited about for a future state where this staging system could be used in trials is that the measures that are used to determine efficacy of treatments are specific to the disease stage, and not a scale that may have, the current standard that is being recommended for many trials aiming to slow or stop disease progression is a part of a unified Parkinson's disease rating scale that's reported by patients and is meaningful, but it was calibrated to the continuum of Parkinson's disease, and it's not very specific to any particular stage of disease severity. And so it could be asking somebody to go out and measure how fast their grass is growing and giving them a yardstick and say, well, good luck, and I hope you can measure that. It's not really calibrated to the task at hand. So these are things that I think that are useful in terms of the design of the trial that the staging system will help enable. And as part of my job at the Fox Foundation for a long time, I was in a partnership role where I was spending time talking to companies. And it's I'm sure if Patrick is in the room, he can talk about this as well. It's very hard for companies to make a decision to invest a lot of money in clinical trials when there's uncertain outcomes. You need to enroll a lot of individuals and you need to run very long trials. It just makes it a very hard case, a very hard business case. Gary, I know you've talked about this as a businessman. You're like, I would like people to do this, but it's a business. And I think the opportunity to fine tune the tools that drug developers have will increase the interest from industry in moving things faster, moving things forward into clinical trials, because they'll have better confidence in the biology, better confidence in the endpoints. And this opens up some different opportunities for engagement with regulators that just changes this from being like a black sheep. So we're not really sure how this is going to turn out to be something that's a much more smart business decision and mapping opportunities with the unmet needs of patients.
You say from a business point, we'll see to the degree we standardize on specific biologics, the enrollment and who we put into the trials, the participants, and also carry through like the third point, because it needs to be done on the back end for endpoints. I think we're just at the starting point with the biologics. We need biological endpoints and standardize that. And then to the degree the participation in industry is accepting the enrollment part of the biologics and the endpoints, it can concentrate on what's needed, the drug development that will change the progression and hopefully slow, halt, or reverse. And they can focus on the money-making aspect of the competition of drug. And let's not have competition in the biologics or the endpoints. I think we could all agree that standardization of that will then lead to what your fourth point was on this chart, speeding up the trial process and not having to have these 3 to 4, 5-year trial, because we know progression is slow, and if it were just measuring on a clinical basis, it's pretty difficult to test changes in progression in short periods of time. But it may not be as difficult to measure changes in the biologics over that time period.
I agree. This is also, the current state is based on what we have today. There are a lot of open questions, but this gives a framework for strategically investing in those open questions or being able to coordinate global funding portfolios to help fill in those gaps, to help build additional biomarker tools that could be used potentially as surrogate endpoints, more objective endpoints for trials. Maybe we'll use this to bring us this section home. The opportunities that are in scope today, what's out of scope today. So with the emphasis that the staging system is meant to evolve, this is the first pass, and I would say it's realistic that there is hesitancy amongst people who would like to have more evidence and more certainty today to start moving this in practice. One of the reasons the Fox Foundation supports this is because patients don't have a lot of time. It's not time neutral. And the longer we wait before we start moving in a more successful direction, the longer people's disease will continue to progress. And so we're comfortable with the some amount of uncertainty, knowing that we can fill in research in a coordinated fashion with others. And we think that there's enough data to suggest that this is going to help a large number of people with Parkinson's get into the right types of studies in the near future. So in scope today is developing treatments based on disease pathology measured by synuclein and dopaminergic dysfunction, alongside clinical symptoms versus just clinical features alone, which is a lot of what's happening right now. This is a major cover our tush. This is very early and for research only. This is not meant to inform discussions and treatment plans with physicians as part of routine care. And we've realized that those types of questions are going to come up. Should I get a biomarker test? Should my child get a biomarker test? This is not where we're at right now, and it's not part of care, but it is going to be important for driving smarter drug development. It's also a helpful framework for understanding research, clinical research broadly, not just clinical trials and therapeutic development, to understand disease in people that have this S&D biomarker and for people who don't. There's many individuals who are clinically diagnosed with Parkinson's or other disorders that will not have these biomarker features. But I think if we just, as research funders, throw money at this blindly and think all people are the same, that does a disservice. And so the opportunity to strategically interrogate what's the biology driving clinical features in people that may not be synuclein positive or may not be DAP positive, but they end up with the same symptoms, helps give more tools for study. That means, though, that this staging system is not universal for everyone with a PD diagnosis. And we think, at least based on the synuclein seed amplification assay data, probably about 10% of people with Parkinson's, 9 or 10, may not fit into this staging system. It does not mean that they are not important, that research funders are not going to focus on it, but we'll be able to focus on it more wisely and more intentionally. Also, right now, the sequence of biomarkers and clinical features are somewhat, well, at least the biomarkers are somewhat static. If you saw, maybe Claire will also talk about this in an easier format. It's like, we're not sure if synuclein really comes first or dopamine comes second, and it doesn't really give quantification. It's really yes, no, do you have it or do you not? And so it's not to the point where Gary said we want to get where you can use a biologic measure of progression. So that's not in it today, but we hope that that's where we will get to in the future with iterations. And the other element of that, which is in the gray, is that the tools, the biomarker tools that are ready today are really homing in on synuclein and dopamine, but there are many other promising biomarkers that are still in development, and we hope that those will get added. Tools around neuroinflammation, tools around lysosomal dysfunction, autophagy, all these sexy words that neurobiologists love. We think that we'll be able to add more biomarker tests and help get to a point where there's better biomarker signals. And maybe, Gary, I'll invite you to just talk on the last slide here. This is the beginning of a journey. This is what the arrow here signifies. This was used at a few different presentations that 7 nonprofit partners had facilitated this spring, that we're on a journey to move the field forward together. And would love for you to talk about what it means to you, knowing what you do about research, knowing what you know about advocating for different patient groups, to have these groups standing behind the potential for a biologic system to accelerate therapeutic development.
I think collaboration always leads to earlier success, better success. In my research, working for some of the entities that are on this list, the coalition, we found that there's just so many organizations around the world that are trying to study and research the same aspects. So a lot of people have the same ideas. There's a lot of time, effort, and money being directed at the same concept. It may be coming out a little bit differently, but ultimately they're looking for the same goal. And the example I'll use is the one that I sort of pressed you on to get this collaboration going, was some research we were doing on patient-reported outcomes. And I was given the assignment of seeing what's out there today. And when I was over 50 ongoing trials and studies, or recently completed studies of academia or nonprofits doing research on patient-reported outcomes, how many different studies do we need? Why couldn't we collaborate and have, the major agencies that are supporting this type of research work on something that would be agreeable to everybody? And again, I go to the point that, we don't need to make the patient-reported outcome the competitive part of a trial. The drug that changes the patient-reported outcomes should be where the competition is and where the money should be made. And we should collaborate and try to standardize what we use on the back end as well as on the front end with the staging biologics. So I think I've been involved for 12 years. You know, Sonia probably could speak better to this after her 25 years. But just in my 12 years, there's been a tremendous change in how these patient charities and advocacy organizations collaborate. You know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, we saw very little collaboration. And, you know, working for several of the organizations and some project development, it was very difficult to get information. I mean, even when we did our first clinical update report on disease-modifying trials back in 2020, it wasn't easy to get the Fox Foundation to give us information because you do a very similar report. And now in the most recent study, not only did you provide a lot of information, but Brian Fisk was one of our co-authors and was invaluable to the fourth update. So it's just an example of how in a short period of time, the prospect of having cooperation coalition has just been amazing. And we saw it at WPC, where we had a number of collaborative presentations from what normally would be competitive organizations. So I think most patients would agree that this is a major opportunity and a major benefit. And I think it helps draw in new advocates to take the place of the old guys like me.
I'm also, this is one of, I get to work on a lot of interesting things at the Fox Foundation. I'll say staging is one of the most exciting for a couple of reasons. I think it has the opportunity to change what is a really hard development path and accelerate treatments for patients. But also because I grew up playing sports and I'm an athlete at heart, but I don't get to play on a lot of teams, you know, in my 40s. I love being on a team with Claire, with Helen, with like-minded partners. And it's been just a joy to see the collaboration and the camaraderie to tackle something big together. And Gary, I can't thank you enough for pushing me to say, hey, like, get out there, do stuff together. And I'm really proud of this and I'm excited to contribute to it moving forward. So thank you, Gary. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Claire. Now time for you to explain this in human terms.
Thank you very much indeed, Gary. Thank you very much indeed. That was a brilliant introduction to where we're at now. Claire, I hate to ask you, we're probably going to need to have a small break here just to give everybody a leg stretch and that sort of thing. But Claire's then going to elaborate on this a little bit more. So the reason why we're labouring the whole point around staging is that tomorrow there are a series of talks about drug developments and things that are coming through in the pipeline. And biology has got to underpin that development. Otherwise, we're not going to get that. We have got to make sure that we're evaluating these potential therapies on that biology. And so the work that Katie is so brilliantly guiding us all through and corralling us into developing this new staging system will really help support the development of some of these new treatments that we'll be talking about tomorrow. But what we're going to be doing after the break, if that's okay, is Claire's going to talk us through this in the simplest possible language, but also help us to ask some questions about it so that we can tease that through and make sure that we communicate this as clearly as we possibly can. And this is where I need your help, Aurelio, please, to help us come up with that language, that dictionary of terms that we all feel comfortable with, and making sure we're not using any terms that could alienate or confuse. So if you're with us this afternoon, that would just be so helpful.